Exactly 50 years ago today, on April the 13th, 1975, a group of gunmen opened fire on a bus of Palestinian civilians in Lebanon, killing 27 and injuring 20 others. Known as the Bus Massacre, this event is widely recognized as the trigger that sparked what would come to be known as the Lebanese Civil War. However, the roots of the conflict are far deeper, and in fact, it is many different wars wrapped up in one. All told, the conflict would rage on for at least 15 years, killing at least 150,000 people, displacing millions, and reconfiguring the entire country and the region. In this episode of the From the Periphery podcast, Elia Ayoub and I, that is Ayman Makarem, go into depth about the many wars that raged in Lebanon between 1975 and 2000. We provide an overview of key events and try to tie together the many different strands, struggles, and conflicts that make up what is better called the Lebanon Wars. We also try as much as possible to connect the history to the present moment, because, as we discuss, the wars never really ended. If you want to learn more about the Lebanon Wars, I'll be hosting a series of online screenings of Lebanese films and documentaries that cover different phases and aspects of the wars. The screenings will be held weekly starting on April 20 and continuing every Sunday for 5 weeks. The screenings will also be followed by a group discussion. Invitations to these screenings will be available through our Patreon, where all members will get immediate access. If you're not yet a member, but want to join the screenings, there are 2 things you can do. Become a member, or buy the invitation via one-time purchase, also available on our Patreon. With that said, thank you, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of the From the Periphery podcast. Today, April 13, marks the 50-year anniversary of the start of the Lebanese Civil War. Most people who know about the war talk about it as wars, because as we'll see in this episode, it's much more than just one thing. And what we're going to try to do together, me and Elia,
Hello.
is go through an overview of the war, a kind of a simplified narrative of the many different wars that stretches between 1975 to 2000, but also talk about how essentially the war never really ended, and many of the things that started the war are still problems. Many of the same actors that came to be during the war are still very much so around, and how we in Lebanon are still very much so living not just in the aftermath, but essentially in the continuation of the Lebanese Civil War. So even though we're regular hosts and creators of the From the Periphery podcast and collective, we figured we'd also give a little bit of an intro to why we know so much about this and why we have a kind of unique perspective. So not only are we both Lebanese, but me, for my part, I am a filmmaker, and I was very active in the 2019 uprisings, wherein my main thing was understanding this history. So I read and I watched basically every film and every documentary, and specifically, documentaries on the Civil War, because that's like the big fascination of Lebanese cinema. So that's me, and that's why I know so much about this, and I do constantly try to simplify or explain the Lebanese Civil Wars in a way that's accessible, even for those that are not Lebanese, but even those that are in Lebanon, to cut through all the propaganda and the sectarian bullshit and whatever. I know, obviously, Elia, you have a much more kind of close relationship to some of these studies.
Closer. I mean, it's a different. It was my PhD, so my PhD was focused on the post-war, and the only way to do it is to do the war. So there was no way of avoiding it. And I will say off the bat that although we are thinking of a non-Lebanese audience, even when we talk among each other, it's not a clear-cut thing, as you said, of like we know when it started. There's an incident which is literally a massacre in 1975 on this day in April 13th in 1975, so 50 years ago, in Ein Rimmene, part of Beirut, against the bus had a bunch of Palestinians in it, and it was the Kataeb, the phalangists or the phalange, that committed the massacre. That in and of itself was a response, quote unquote, to a tit for tat, in which there's an attempted assassination at the leader of the Kataeb, and then before that, and so on and so on. There isn't really this one thing that started it, but it is the spark. It is definitely the most violent event that had happened in a while. But to get immediately into the meta of it all, like even while you were introducing it, you said 1975 to 2000 instead of 1975 to 1990. And the thing is that that is accurate. It's also accurate to say 1990. It's accurate to say 2000. It's actually accurate to say 2005 for different reasons that we'll get into and hopefully not confuse the shit out of our audience, but we'll do our best.
Yeah, just to start with that, the reason I picked 2000 is because that is when the south of Lebanon was liberated from Israeli occupation. But if you Google it, if you're on Wikipedia, it'll say the Lebanese Civil War ended 1990 with the signing of the Ta'if Accord. Again, we're going to get into all this stuff. We're going to assume basically that we're not going to not assume that you don't know anything, but we're not going to say too many names. Any names we do say, we're going to sort of explain a bit or give a tiny bit of background. Anyway, so yeah, before we get into actually dealing with the history, do you want to talk a little bit about why we're marking this date? I think a lot of people will see, we'll release this on the date, on April 13. And I think there's going to be a lot of commemorations that people will see online of like April 13. But before we start with the actual history, I know you have a lot of thoughts about the kind of almost like problematic nature of marking this date because it's the beginning and not the end.
Yeah, it's highly symbolic. Luqman Slim, actually, who was a memory worker who was assassinated by Hezbollah a few years ago, at least his organization, wrote this article that I use in the PhD that talks about that, like how it's quite bizarre and certainly curious. And I think they use even like harsher words, like it shows a certain complicity in many ways that we as a society, like a collective complicity, that we commemorate the beginning of a war or wars rather than the end, because you would know when the World War II started, but you think of D-Day, for example, as the beginning of the end, or obviously when Hitler killed himself, and then the next day, etc., etc. You have these end of commemorations because that's when you celebrate the end of the war, of a war or multiple wars. But in Lebanon, most people would not know when the Taif Agreement was signed. Certainly not know when the amnesty law was signed. It was like a few months after that, because why would they? Yeah, I think it was very quickly understood, and I don't think it needed that much explaining because like people experience the civil wars or the Lebanese wars, as I prefer to call them, on a day-to-day, on and off, in some cases, depending on where they lived, and in many cases, like if you were in southern Lebanon, it didn't even end in 1990 anyway. There was 10 more years to go. And if you are in parts of Lebanon, then you would also consider the Syrian occupation of the Assad regime at the time as ongoing until the year 2005. So it really depends when and where essentially you lived and what your immediate and maybe familial experiences or whatever neighborhood and regional and what the experiences are to even have this timeline. And so yeah, it gets messy immediately, but not in a way that I would hope is like incomprehensible. It's just it speaks to it's been forcibly simplified for political reasons. We can get into that probably, but that's how I would start at least.
Yeah, I mean, growing up in Lebanon, there's definitely that feeling that it is incomprehensible, but also that it is not worth looking into because it's scary and it's sensitive. And there's a sort of thing that the political leaders say whenever you talk about the stuff, or like that there's actual movement trying to bring it up, that what you want to start another civil war. But again, I do think, just amplifying what you were saying, that there's something very interesting about the fact of marking the beginning and not the end. Because even though, yeah, we have like some dates of when the amnesty law was signed, when the Ta'if Accord was signed, but it's not really a celebration date because the fighting ended, but there was no victory. There was no celebration after. It was just like, hey, finally it stopped, you know?
And because the main participants are the ones who signed it, and they continue to be, or among the main participants are the ones who signed it, and they continue. They just one person put it like they removed their, military garbs and they put on their suits, basically.
Business suits, yeah, and parliamentarian
Yeah.
suits. And yeah, a lot of them are just still ruling the country, and you can't really understand Lebanon without understanding that, like where the main players come from, why Lebanon is in the state it's in. So yeah, okay. So let's begin. We're gonna take you through a journey that starts basically in like around the late 60s. Again, like I said, we're not gonna get too deep into anything because obviously this is an hour-long podcast. And yeah, we're gonna try to do this thing of like going into the history and then bringing it into the present, and then going back into the history and then bringing it to the present. And we're gonna do so by picking basically like five, six key themes, right? So the first one I'm gonna start with is essentially the lead up to the war. There's a book by Fawaz Trabulsi, the Lebanese Marxist historian, called The Modern History of Lebanon. And this book was fundamental for me in my understanding of the class dynamics, the economic pressures and forces that led up to the 1975 moment. As we said, April 13 marks the moment of marks a massacre of Palestinians by far-right Christian groups, the main political party, the Phalange. At the same time, though, there was, for at least 7 years, a series of capitalist collapses, of economic crises, and of an emboldened labor movement. People in Lebanon, especially revolutionaries, leftists, were very inspired by May 1968, the sort of revolutionary waves that sort of started in Paris and France, rather, and obviously Lebanon being a former colony of France and speak French and whatever. But there's also another really important film here called A Feeling Greater Than Love. And in this documentary film, really depicts the labor movement. I forget who said it. Maybe you can remind me, Elia, that had there not been a civil war in 1975, there would have been a revolution. Lebanon at the time, the economy was, it's described as the Switzerland of the Middle East because of the banking sector. And that was like such a huge part of the economy. But at the same time, you had so many people, especially in the countryside, who essentially was still like a feudal system. And they were being exploited under wage labor, poverty, like wealth inequality was skyrocketing. It's kind of a lot of bullshit when people talk about Lebanon, the golden age, you know? Because for a lot of people, and especially people of a certain sect, which is in terms of the south and the east of the country, the Shia, they were kind of what are described at the time as the downtrodden, the peasantry. And so this I find like a really important kind of background for the kind of political economic tensions that were forming that then, you know, and part of it are the Palestinian groups who were more leaning towards like the left, communists and the like. And so they allied themselves with like Lebanese groups who were agitating and pushing for reform of the system. And basically, yeah, that's like something I find really important. And obviously, if you want to go with it to like, bring that to the present moment, because in many ways it's the same exact economic system. But it's important to note as well that part of the reason I'm bringing all this up in, 1975 is sure, April 13 was the trigger that started the 15-year civil war, but there had been many clashes before then, not just between Lebanese groups, not just between Lebanese groups and Palestinian groups, but also between the army and Palestinian groups who, the Fedayeen movement had been, doing operations from Lebanese soil, and so the army gets involved. This is a whole shit show. But it's enough to say that it wasn't like all well and good, and then boof, 75 happens.
I guess it's enough at least at this stage to say that you can you can pick and choose almost where you want to start. It's like where when does the crisis quote unquote start? Like you can go back to 1958 when you had like nationalists versus pan-Arabists, and you had the first actual U.S. intervention in the Middle East, invited by the Lebanese president at the time, Shamoun. So, like, and of course, the 60s, the 1967 war, Lebanon against the Israelis and the Arabs, Lebanon was not that involved, but, there are repercussions. In 1970, Black September in Jordan, there are repercussions on Lebanon. You can start in different places, but uh, in many ways, doing so is almost artificial, or rather, like, as I said, like where you start almost is just depending on how far back you want to go, because there isn't really a beginning as you can point to, like, this is when everything started. That being said, I also don't know who mentioned that, but I do think someone did actually say this, and the quote of like, if there wasn't a civil war, there would have been a revolution. Because in some sense, the civil war was a way of preventing any kind of revolution. And a good way of sort of understanding this, and maybe this kind of bridges into the next section, is that the first phase of what we now call the 15-year-long Lebanese Wars or the Civil War, at the time, just like the war or whatever, how they called it, lasted only 2 years, 75 to 1977, and 76 even really. But 77 is like there was some extensions from that. And it very quickly, you had these two main camps, effectively. One which was effectively exclusively Christian and Christian right wing. They had some non-Christians, but like very, very negligible numbers, led by the Kataeb, the Phalangists. Phalange, for those who don't know, a quick thing, is named after Franco's Phalange, as in the Spanish fascist. And very much the founder, Pierre Gemayel, sorry. Long story short, he went to the Olympics in Berlin during the Third Reich, and he liked what he saw. That's kind of the long story short. And he very much modeled his own, like there was a youth, modeled after the Hitler Youth and so on and so forth. Those guys were basically the ruling elites, effectively. Not the only ones, but they had a disproportionate amount of like power. And it was obviously very unpopular because most people in Lebanon were not phalangists. They just had, for mostly colonial reasons, due to their proximity to the French at the time, they had the power. I'm simplifying a bit. But despite that, despite the fact that they were effectively the state, they had lost most of the territory by 1976. In a year, more or less, I don't have the exact timeline in mind, in about a year, the Lebanese national movement, as it came to be known, which was like this very broad coalition of nationalists, Lebanese and pan-Arab actually, nationalists rather, seculars of the different varieties, including some Nasserites and whatever, and a bunch of leftists, communists, and so on, allied with the Palestinians, notably the PLO. Basically, took over. I don't have the numbers. Like a good chunk of the country, like it's over 80% by 76. And in many ways, the Civil War could have ended then and there. They had a manifesto led by, at the time, the leader being Kamal Jumblat on the Lebanese side, to basically have Lebanon as call it a secular socialist state with, good welfare and stuff like that, which was by all accounts a popular thing, like as the most people seem to have wanted this, at least from the sources that we know. And now we're at least in 76/77, so we can take it from there if you want.
Yeah. I mean, so I think it is good to just talk about the 2 year war,
Yeah.
as in what I'm describing is the lead up to 75. And the 75 moment is very much then plays out kind of in those 2 years. So going back a little bit and what you were talking about with the sectarian system, it's that is a huge part of like the tensions leading up to this moment. Like you essentially have a sectarian elite who are installed by a colonial power, and it's just a bad system. Like you read through it, it just does not work. It does not fit. It's kind of like this imposed thing to the benefit of like a tiny minority, like a minority within a minority.
We can be more specific. Like most positions in power had to be occupied by Christians
Yeah.
at the time. Part of actually the how the war quote unquote ended is that some of that was redistributed among other sects as well. But effectively, this was the deal. And being the president had to be a Maronite Christian. Of course, the prime minister has to be Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of parliament has to be Shia Muslim. But at the time, up until the Civil War, the president had much, much more power than what was negotiated, if you want, as part of the Taif agreement as of the 90s.
Hmm. So yeah, this is kind of the sectarian system in a nutshell. There's a lot more to go into detail about it, obviously, because it's literally a unique system in the world, and there are clear faults with it and problematics, and it's a system that is like by design breeds inequality, and inequality in a class sense, but also in a sectarian sense. And so this is part of the backdrop to then the kind of movements to dismantle or reform that system. So like it is a combination of the sectarian oligarchy system. And then you had a movement that, like you were describing, the two camps that like were fighting to defend that system. In my recent video essay, where the Arabs, I have a quote by the son of the founder of the Phalange, who says, "We used violence to protect the system." Like our goal was to preserve the sectarian system. And so the 75 moment, you will essentially have these two camps. And the 2 year war between 75 and 77 is a war by and large between a ruling sect that is defending a system that ensures its hegemony, and a coalition of not just many sects, but also many political tendencies, from liberals to socialists to communists to pan-Arabists to nationalists, from Muslims to Christians. And again, Christians here, it's really important because when we talk about Christians in Lebanon, we are talking about the Maronite Christian sect that has the presidency, that has whatever. Orthodox Christians cannot be president. But it's enough to say that within that coalition was also the Palestinian groups, the PLO and the PFLP being like the largest two amongst them. They were allied with the LNM. And I mean, there was a poll at the time that found that people supported the Fadayin, the Palestinian fighters, like even though it was eliciting, their actions were eliciting Israeli responses or whatever, like there was a solidarity within the Lebanese national movement very strongly with the Palestinian movement and the Palestinian struggles for liberation. And so what are so essentially then these two groups, the LNM on one side, who are supported by a few states here and there, but not really, because some of them are like straight up communists. And then you have the Phalange, who are the ruling authority. This one, very interestingly, is supported by two different states, and like strongly supported: the Syrian state and the Israeli state. And that we're going to get into later. But just to cap this moment, the 2 year war that we're describing, that essentially starts with the attempt through armed struggle to reform the sectarian system, and also, defending the sectarian system, depending on what side you're looking at, kind of ends with two main things: the military intervention by Hafiz al-Assad in 1976, and the assassination of Kemal Jumblat, who was the head of the Lebanese national movement, also by the Syrian state. And this kind of puts an end to the fighting for this period, and obviously has massive ramifications up until today. I mean, quite literally, just 2 months ago, or like a month ago, the new Syrian government captured a military intelligence officer who was widely known as the person who killed Kemal Jumblat. And his son, Walid Jumblat, who's now like 70 years old, but he always looked like he's 70 years old, came out and said, like, finally, we can stop commemorating the murder, the assassination of my father, because now we know when we have the person, essentially.
Oh, we've known from the year, like it was not a secret. The
Yeah,
name was known, it was like not, and like Hafiz al-Assad was, we won't get into the details, but like he was boasting about it to Walid at the time, to like the son of Kamal Jumblat. It wasn't a secret whatsoever. It was just publicly known.
but now they have the guy. He's
Yeah.
been captured. And so I think this is a kind of a powerful example of how these histories, very, very much so, are still being played out. So that's the 2 year war in a nutshell.
Mhm.
I don't know if you want to talk like bringing into the present. I mean, I just gave a kind of example there, but the collapse of the Assad regime, you know what I mean? But also how the Assad regime was always in support of the sectarian system in Lebanon, and especially at the time, was kind of like a big dog, you know what I mean? Like playing around in a way that like I don't know, Bashar never really could, or rather that the Syrian state has become so weak because of his rule.
Um, Instead of going necessarily to the present, we can tie it to almost the next big phase of the Civil War. If you want to go directly to 1982, we can go in between as well. And for a few reasons, actually pretty easy to understand, although the topics are quite difficult. The intervention and the invasion of the Syrian army was immediately followed by the Tel Zata massacre, which was committed by the same actors, the Phalangists, etc., with the support of the Syrian state. This was in 1976. So 6 years before the massacre that's kind of more well known or more notorious or whatever around the world, which is the Sabra and Shatila massacre in 1982 during the siege of Beirut by the Kataeb again and the Lebanese forces. The names don't matter that much at this point, but by the same kind of Christian fascists, backed at that point by the Israelis instead of by the Syrians. And the justification for invading Lebanon in 1976 publicly by Hafez al-Assad was that he was going to quote unquote protect the Christians. And this was signaling to the Americans and also signaling to the Israelis, like, we got this basically. And in return, we get to, of course, get a piece of the pie once we destroy that, at the time, as I said, the opposition, if you want to call it that, the LNM, which had control of most of the country by then. And that's exactly what happened. And so you can't quite, like, a lot of histories of Lebanon, at least online, we see this discursively wise. When they think of the civil war, they tend to jump immediately to 1982. Or if they talk about 75, they would talk about maybe the bus massacre, which is of course important. But then they sort of jump what happened actually between those two and why 1982 was. I'm not gonna say why it happened, but why it was rendered much easier in terms of the invasion of the Israelis.
Yeah, no, for sure. And again, we should mention that the Lazata is also a Palestinian refugee camp,
Yes.
in which hundreds, I don't remember the exact number, were killed. It was
Yeah.
besieged by the Phalange for a while. The reason that I think it is important to distinguish between the 2 year war essentially and then the 80s is because there is kind of when I'm reading the history a lot more clarity in those first 2 years. There was like ideological and political kind of goals and differences and whatever. In the 80s, which is very much so what's depicted, like in a film like West Beirut, where it is just specifically in Beirut, like neighborhoods divided up, and you have essentially gangs, like people who used to be communists or like the communists or the socialists, the nationalists, the whatever. It really doesn't fucking matter because it is just about controlling certain areas.
It becomes a war economy by then.
It literally becomes a war economy, and then it
Yeah.
becomes so convoluted and so confusing, and it has a logic of its own. Like no one really is fighting for anything. And the changing of alliances is also super fucking complicated. Again, when I read this, this blew my mind that the Syrians in 1976 invaded to attack the Palestinians, to attack the Lebanese national movement, to let's say attack the Muslims, even though it's not a religious thing, but in this sort of sectarian framing, to protect the Phalange, who I've only known them as enemies in my entire life, and especially because I've always known the Phalange as being allied with the Israelis. And they were allied with the Israelis and kind of still are in a way. And to me, it kind of broke my mind until I understood, because it is about protecting the sectarian system. It
Yeah.
is ensuring, it is being the kind of like intervention to prevent this kind of change, this progressive, anti-sectarian, kind of radical democratic potential or something, a coalition. It's scary to all the regimes, as well as to Israel.
Any kind of victory of that kind would have been a threat to Hafez al-Assad's regime and to the Israeli regime, much more than anything that the Phalangists, for example, could ever pose. Even if one day they would like decide not to be on their good sides or whatever, there wasn't this ideological victory or this ideological threat rather. And this was in a context, we're talking about 76, where in 1970 there was effectively a quick civil war in Jordan against the monarchy because the monarchy was allied with the Israeli state. And that's when you had Black September, i.e., the massacre against Palestinians by the Jordanian state, and that they were expulsed, the Palestinian militias, to Lebanon. And that was actually Nasser's doing. We won't get into it, it doesn't matter as much. But the point is that, like, Hafiz al-Assad had a model in mind of what could happen, basically, in his mind, if the Palestinians, as he saw it, would win in Lebanon. Because very much like the his goal was quite literally, like, as a quite explicitly and quite focused to crush the Palestinians and also all of the Lebanese with them, but really first and foremost to crush the Palestinians. And that's like in the DNA of the Assad regime. It started in 1970, and we're talking just 6 years later. And we're talking about like everything that came after that in many ways, not only, of course, but was a way, in one way or another, of just maintaining as much control as possible and certainly influence. They even called it Pax Syriana as of the 90s over the sectarian system, which was only possible, and here I'm jumping into the 90s, but we'll backtrack a bit, would have only been possible with an agreement between the Syrian state and the Israeli state, because by then you already had the occupation of southern Lebanon by Israel and the rest of Lebanon de facto occupied by the Syrian state. So there was quite literally a line, and they agreed on the line, and they agreed to respect each other's boundaries.
Yeah. And you look into the history and those cables, those communications using the Americans as a intermediary was happening. And so yeah, so I don't want to get too far into any one thing because I think but I think listeners can tell that obviously the problem is like Lebanon is not only a tiny country with a lot of different ethnic and religious sects and groups and political tendencies, but it is also intimately tied to everything else happening in the region. And this is a very, whatever, exciting region. And so I do find it a disservice, obviously, because when we talk about April 13, we're talking about a massacre of Palestinians in Lebanon. When we talk about Tel al-Zatar, we're talking about a massacre of Palestinians in Lebanon. When we talk about Sabra Shatila, we're talking about the massacre of Palestinians in Lebanon. And these are some of the most notorious events. And so it's not to suggest, obviously, though, that like Lebanese weren't also killed or that there weren't massacres even by Palestinian militias.
The Damour one is the most notorious one.
The mood, but also like the 80s, it gets really
Yeah,
fucked
yeah.
up. And like the checkpoints and the killings by what's called by ID, which was a notorious practice, basically where, checkpoints were set up and people would have to pass through them and they would see the ID and depending on whatever. There's a really disturbing story that is still remnant, which is to do with the Arabic word for tomato.
Hmm.
Sometimes at checkpoints, they'd ask people kind of absurd questions. How do you make a fattoush? How do you make a
Yeah.
salad?
Hmm.
And when they say, oh, bandura, just because of the pronunciation, they could tell this person was Palestinian and then
Hmm.
take them out and kill them. Or this person
Instead of
was
Banadura.
like there's a bunch of accents, but you can tell from what like area, what location, whatever. And so, but so I think what I'm getting at is that I think it's a disservice that I notice a lot of readings of Lebanese history try to remain internal, as though the Palestinians are just an external force. The Maronite narrative that you'll probably see a lot in the comment section of this video of this episode will be from. I mean, this is what the Wikipedias are like. Like the Wikipedia of the Lebanese Civil War is atrocious, and it just constantly very like leaning towards a kind of Maronite centric perspective and narrative, which is that this was like the Palestinians were kicked out of Palestine, kicked out of Jordan, and they brought their miseries to us, and they brought their wars to us. And that kind of is a narrative that still very much so exists today, where people still talk about we can't afford to fight other people's wars. But I think obviously, and I know I'm jumping way into the present, but like the Nakba of 1948, the mandate of between the European colonial mandates of 1918 to like 1940s. Like you said at the beginning, we can start at so many different points in history, but it is very difficult not to at least acknowledge the incredible imperialist and colonial ruptures in the region, starting from the First World War, that are still playing out. Because like
Yeah.
the Nakba is the manifestation, the most violent proof of Zionism, but it did not start in 48. But regardless, just to sort of connect it, a lot of people I see do not talk about the Lebanese Civil War and then also connect it to the Nakba. It's as though Palestinians just like magically appeared in Lebanon. And so the wars that happened not even before immediate, like direct Israeli involvement, intimately tied with Palestinian history and intimately tied with the Nakba. Like inseparable, really. I don't know how people form a kind of coherent narrative without doing that.
It's become a convenient scapegoat after the war, and it's been retroactively fitted to explain the war in many ways, the wars. There is an argument to be made, and this is one of my I'm not the only one who said this, but it's like it is it's something that I focused on as well in my like PhD, whatever, is that one of the main reasons the Civil War ended the way it did and when it did is that there was a broad agreement on who to scapegoat, and that was the Palestinians. And to some extent, the south of Lebanon and Shia Lebanese to a different extent, although that played out in different ways as of the 90s. But effectively, like the Israelis were happy with this agreement because this arrangement, because of course they exiled the PLO, for those who don't know, in 1982 to Tunis from Beirut after the siege of Beirut and massacre and so on. And the Syrians were very happy with that as well.
I think let's slow down there actually.
Okay.
So, 1982, the Israelis fully invade. They get to Beirut.
Hmm.
They send in what the French describe as like more tanks than they have, period, into Lebanon. And the reasoning they, like you're saying, the reasoning why what they were saying of like their narrative is we want to go and dislodge the PLO from Beirut.
There was an attack against the embassy in London, the Israeli one, by a another group, actually not by the PLO, and or an attempted attack, I don't remember. And the Israelis used that as their casus belli, their justification for invading Lebanon to actually destroy the PLO, which was not involved in the attack. But it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter, but I think it's really relevant because we see that exact tactic played out today, where it's like, oh, here's a thing that possibly happened. We're going to do this insane escalation that like violates every code of international law. They besieged Beirut, which is the capital city, to the point that, and they bombarded it to the point that Ronald Reagan, the humanitarian, called, I think it was Begin, the prime minister at
Yep.
the time, and told him, this is a Holocaust.
After Sabra and Shatila massacre specifically.
And so they pulled out of Beirut, but the Israelis continued to occupy southern Lebanon until 2000. And this is an important point to kind of like discuss a bit in detail because I think obviously this is super relevant today because Lebanon just had another war with Israel, which is kind of the second major one since this period. But yeah, so because okay, so what we described is that in 76, the Syrians invaded and intervened in Lebanon and occupied parts of the country. What that occupation looked like was mostly like an integration into the security services, into the Interior Ministry, and kind of replicated its own and like extended its surveillance state into the state.
Most notoriously the Mukhabarat, the intelligence services.
Yeah. Which I very much so, even in my youth and my innocence, kind of felt in terms of like, oh, there's stuff you can't say, like don't talk in public. But obviously in the west and the north of the country, it was much more severe. In 1982, I mean, first 78, but really the full invasion of Lebanon by the Israelis in 1982. And once they kind of pull out of Beirut, and a part of the reason they pull out of Beirut is because of the popular resistance against the Israeli occupation. You had many famous operations, you had new groups forming that were like solely just resisting within Beirut. And a few months later, they pulled out of Beirut, and Beirut became the very first Arab capital to liberate itself from Zionist occupation. They, as in the Israelis, pulled out of Beirut, continued to occupy, I believe, the south up until the Litani River, and their occupation looked very different. They were not integrating to the state. I mean, there is largely not really much of a state to begin with in the south, but they occupied. They had their soldiers, and they had a proxy force called the South Lebanon Army. They were creating what they still talk about today, the buffer zone, right? So create this area wherein we control completely, and so any militants that might fire at us will be all the way over there. What this looked like was a brutal occupation, which included massacres, which bred resistance. The state, obviously, still reeling after its own kind of war and invasion and whatever, and with the Syrian involvement, there was never really any fighting between like the Lebanese army and the Israelis, right? So this is where the Lebanese resistance, this is where groups, I mean, literally 1982 is when a group called Hezbollah makes its first appearance, does a very famous operation against American military barracks, and they were a guerrilla fighting force in the south that sort of started like there was grassroots stuff, but very quickly on they were getting funding from the new Islamic Republic of Iran, right? This also has to do with the fact that the other group at the time, the other like sectarian resistance group, was being funded by the Assad regime, most notably, specifically, Harakat Amal, the Hope movement. But it's important to note in this period as well that like there was a broad coalition of groups, of militants, of guerrilla fighters, including very importantly the communists, who were fighting in the south to liberate villages and towns from Israeli occupation. And ultimately, by 2000, they were successful. And they're actually, interesting enough to tie to the very beginning of this episode, we do mark Liberation Day, right? There we do mark the kind of end of what's called, we don't mark the beginning of the occupation, but rather the end of it. But in many ways, in 2006, now in 2024, and since this latest aggression, but even before, our sovereignty has always been threatened and violated by the state of Israel. And we are in a new, in my opinion, a new state, a new phase of Israeli occupation. And so in that way, that invasion of 1982 never really went away. There was no Hezbollah when they went in. They literally created the situation, the environment within which Hezbollah forms, and now use essentially the exact same arguments and narratives as they would with the PLO in the 70s, but now with Hezbollah. And so you kind of see that continuation of this perpetual war on terror thing, which constantly necessitates aggression, occupation, and like imperial violence.
Yeah, and they had they still had, I mean, detailed maps of Lebanon, especially South Lebanon, that facilitated their re-invasion, obviously 6, 7, 8 months ago now, and ongoing occupation of parts of the country and so on. That never went away. That was always a huge part of the Israeli security establishment, like the Lebanon question, as they themselves would phrase it, in a way that they never did, for example, with Hafiz al-Assad and with Bashar al-Assad. There was no Syrian question because they occupied the Golan Heights as of 1970, and they continue to do so to this day. But Lebanon, for those, specific reasons, always had this completely different dimension to it. We won't get into it as much here, but for those who are interested, like we have done more deep dives on the Fire these times, not on this podcast, on Hezbollah and on, the occupation of South Lebanon and stuff like that. So people can check those out if they want. We are certainly no fans of the group or anything like that. It's just a matter of like contextualizing and explaining why they came, in which context they came, and in many ways, the history that we still have to this day.
No, and it's important to note that, yeah, like between 82 and 2000, it was, like I said, a coalition. And there is very presently like a kind of a need for resistance. But I think what we find is like in the later period after 2000, for sure, the kind of consolidation and monopolization of said resistance, which is hella problematic, and also the choices they've made. And also, again, you look at the very different nature of the Communist Party and how they view resistance, and like how revolution is a part of the resistance. Whereas for groups like Hezbollah, like they're an anti-revolutionary and counter-revolutionary party. But regardless, the civil wars officially end with the signing of the Ta'if Accord in 1990 in Saudi Arabia in a town called Ta'if. This deal essentially ended the fighting. What it did is it slightly changed the quota of how many Muslims, how many Christians. It reduced the power of the executive, of the presidency. It increased the power of the Speaker of the House. And essentially was all done under the tutelage, under the supervision of Hafiz al-Assad, who was still basically ruling the country at the time, or occupying large parts of it. They found some compromise candidates for the prime minister. They found the good, ideal candidates for these roles. And essentially, the man of the hour was Rafiq Hariri, who instituted like neoliberal economic reforms, which brought some life into the economy, and essentially, or I mean, I should say, was able to then convert what was a dying war economy into a kind of burgeoning, I'll say, class war economy. To me, how I read this period, starting with the 90s and like up until I would say 2019, when it all popped and the revolution started, but also that the economic collapse started happening, was that the warring parties of the Civil War were like, we can make so much more bank fighting the people than fighting each other. And so they put on their suits, they set up these deals, they stopped like open aggression and engaged in what I see as class aggression and class war. The economy started getting a bit better in as like pegged the lira to the dollar. I would say this is a kind of period that like artificially floated all boats, but it all came crashing in 2019. And for the last 5 years, Lebanon's been like laboring under this grueling economic crisis that has its roots essentially in the agreement that ended the Civil War.
And immediately after, the Taif Agreement was actually signed in 89, but immediately after, like in the year that followed, there was a continuation of the Civil War itself. The whole, we won't get into the details, but the then General Michel Aoun declared his war of liberation in rejection of the Taif Agreement and against the Syrian regime at the time. Fast forward 15 years later of exile, he actually becomes allied with the Syrians and the Syrian regime and Hezbollah, but it doesn't matter right now. All of this to say that even as there is a reason why we don't commemorate the Taif Agreement, because it didn't actually stop the violence. Quite literally, we still had the War of the Mountains and the War of Liberation, whatever that followed after that. In 94, I believe there was a big assassination, and so on and so forth, not to mention the occupation of South Lebanon by the Israelis, obviously, and the Khiam prison torture complex and all of that stuff. None of this and so many things we can get into, but just like really to emphasize the fact that it is purely artificial and there's no real meaning to deciding this is when the date of like saying this is when the war ended because there really isn't one. It just make things a bit easier to remember if you want, but more than that, it's there's no meaningful changes. I'm not gonna say that like, of course there was a mass scale violence, which is the civil war that stopped. That element of it stopped. So of course there were changes and people were hopeful and in many reasons that's why I exist because like that generation of Lebanese, many of them came back. I was born in France in 91, but came back to Lebanon because of, had hope in the country because literally, as you mentioned, Hariri rebuilding the country and so on and so forth. Like there was really that discourse. We cannot deny it. But like it's with this privilege in many ways and curse in other ways of hindsight 50 years down the line that you see many more similarities between like certain episodes of what's called the Civil War, the Lebanese Wars between 75 and 1990 and, last year, or like 10 years ago or whatever.
Actually, it's very interesting that you mentioned because I'm only literally just right now making the connection with the fact that I was born in Saudi and my father had moved, I think like 5, 6 years prior, like towards the end of the war, but like essentially to find work. And I was born there because of the war. And then we came back in 2002 or 3, and this was that phase where it was like things are a bit, I mean, calmer essentially, and it has been for a while, and things are picking back up. Sorry, it's just very funny that I've just made that connection right now. But there's also two really important things to note. One is the disappeared. There has been political case for the uncovering of like it's about I think 20,000 people who were forcibly disappeared during the war, whose fates are still unknown, who their families still do not know if they're dead or alive, and if they are like dead, who killed them, where they buried. And this, I think, is a really important reason why the war never ended and why there is not really much celebration, because there are just so many questions. There was essentially no accountability. And in many ways, a lot of the crimes, there was no justice, right? There was no justice. And so there was no Liberation Day, independence, or whatever, like a victory or an end, kind of, And with that, you have the fact that the exact same people who are the most culpable, the most criminal, ruling the country for still today. The head of the parliament for the last 30 years, one of the most notorious criminals and warlords of the Civil War. All of them, so many parliamentarians, so many of the key figures.
I can add though, there is really I spend a lot of time thinking about and working on or whatever, writing about the disappeared in Arabic, which is called mafudi, like the missing. But effectively, they're kidnapped and they forcibly disappeared is the term that should be used in at least in English. There is like it's not even just like, oh, this is a different perspective or whatever, but like if you are a relative of those who were forcibly disappeared, there is no end to the civil war to you. The Lebanese state literally told you, forced you in many ways, like you had to decide to declare your loved one dead, or for example, you cannot get the inheritance of your husband, which you have to decide now is actually your late husband, even though you didn't know this, or your son, or it's usually males, but there were of course many women as well, mostly Lebanese, but many Palestinians as well. We found out with the collapse of the Assad regime, Lebanese who were still in Syria after, fucking 30 years. We thought that many of them, one of them was there for 40 years. The Syrian state had declared them all dead. And we found that, of course, this wasn't the case. And many Lebanese were, including those who were part of that movement like for the disappeared and so on, were saying, actually, no, that we have no confirmation that they are dead, and we have to continue as with the assumption that they are not. It's really important to have that in mind. But they're rendered invisible politically. They're rendered like discursively, like you cannot talk about them because talking about them brings up all of these again ghosts of the past, and this is why we don't do it, at least as a society.
Wow, yeah. I think that actually brings us very much to a close. I mean, just the physicality of it all, like quite literally, it's underneath us. Like there's like and we're sort of just like walking over and trying to continue because there's this like fear of the Civil War. And that's a fear we've been raised with as Lebanese of a certain generation, of like the post-war generation. And so even discussions like this, even discussions of like this or that party, this history, that history, it's usually not done. And so I hope this episode was at least somewhat helpful and informative for those of you listening. We hope to do more of this type of stuff. We might do stuff that's a bit more detailed so that there can be more understandings of Lebanon and its history, especially in the present moment of, there's a lot of focus on Lebanon because of the Israeli aggression, because of the kind of new American hegemony of the region and sort of like imperialist emboldening and whatever, but also the collapse of the Assad regime. Like Lebanon is that piece that's there that people just can't make heads or tails of. And it is really complicated, but we exist as Lebanese and we're trying to figure out. And so if you've gotten this far, thank you so much for joining us, for listening with us, and for like keeping up with us. So yeah, and wrapping up, just to say, I've been your co-host, Ayman Makarem. I'm on Blue Sky if you want to follow me at Ayman Makarem. I'm also on Instagram at Politically Depressed, which is the name of my podcast. And yeah, you can follow me there.
Myself, also on Blue Sky and Mastodon. I have a newsletter called Hauntologies, hence again the hauntings, and I do talk about some of the topics we talk about. One of my focus I want to get really into is the disappeared because it depresses me a lot, but also it's important to talk about. And yeah, my podcast is The Fire These Times, and both The Fire These Times and Politically Depressed are part of from the Periphery Media Collective, which this podcast is also part of. We do a lot of podcasts. And to support all of these things and more, including Ayman's video essays, including his most recent one, Where Are the Arabs, which he just referenced on, which you can find already on YouTube, just head out to patreon.com/from the periphery. And by doing so, you of course support us and you get early access to basically everything we do, as well as access to our monthly hangout and occasional film clubs and just things that we keep on trying to do to genuinely show our gratitude because of course we cannot do this without Patreon supporters, so thanks for that.
Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you all next time.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks everyone.
From the Periphery is a worker-owned media collective. We focus on elevating voices, struggles, and ideas that are peripheralized and marginalized under mainstream journalism and academia. If you like the work we do and want to see more of it, please consider heading over to patreon.com and become a member today. For as little as $5 a month, you get access to exclusive content, an invitation to our monthly hangout, and to join the community that's been growing around our work. If you can't support financially, there are still a number of ways you can support us. You can leave a 5-star rating on the podcast app you're using to listen, like and subscribe if you're on YouTube, and leave a comment wherever you're listening, all of which helps us against the algorithm. Most importantly, tell your friends and family about us to help spread the word. Thank you so much for listening.